Welcome, everyone, to the Q&A session for our upcoming course, Julian of Norwich, the 7-week journey exploring a bold, gentle visionary's thoughts and observations on living in a time of pandemic. I'm Lisa Bonnice, and it's my honor to be hosting this Q&A conversation for the Shift Network, where we'll explore the teachings of two of my favorite people, Mirabai Starr and Matthew Fox, and address questions about their upcoming 7-week course, Julian of Norwich, which begins Wednesday, December 2nd. And a little later, I'll explain how you can participate in the course, even if you can't attend the live sessions. That's not a problem. But first, I want to introduce our guests. First, Reverend Matthew Fox, PhD, author, theologian, and activist priest, has been calling people of spirit and conscience into the creation spirituality lineage for over 50 years. His 38 books, lectures, retreats, daily meditations, and innovative education models have ignited an international movement to awaken people to be mystics, prophets, and contemplative activists who honor and defend the earth and work for justice. Mirabai Starr, an award-winning author of creative nonfiction and contemporary translations of sacred literature, has received critical acclaim for her revolutionary new translations of John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul and Teresa of Avila's The Interior Castle. Mirabai's newest book, Wild Mercy, Living the Fierce and Tender Wisdom of the Women Mystics, was named one of the best books of 2019 by Spirituality and Practice. And in just a few minutes, we're going to open up for your questions. But first, I want to bring Mirabai and Matthew online and ask them each to share just a bit about what Julian of Norwich means to them. Welcome, Matthew and Mirabai.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa. Matthew, I'd love it if you would begin. What does Julian mean to you?
Oh, well, I'm moved that she is such a fine exemplar of the lineage of creation spirituality, that she had these giants preceding her, including Jesus, who comes from the wisdom tradition of Israel, which is a creation-centered tradition of mysticism and nature, finding God in nature. But Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century, followed by Francis of Assisi, and then Thomas Aquinas, then Mechtilde Magdeburg, then Meister Eckhart, and then Julian is kind of the cherry on the top of this lineage. And the fact that she's the only one of these great souls that lived through a pandemic. And so that makes her contribution, I think, especially challenging. But she does not back away from the goodness of nature and trust in nature and finding God in nature. In fact, she says God is in nature, and even God is nature. And God is a goodness in all of nature. So even though she was living through a dire time of pandemic, her entire lifetime, the bubonic plague hit when she was 7 years old, she never lost awareness or touch with what's deeper than the suffering, and that is the goodness of nature and really the miracle that we're here. And so I find her to be both a deep mystic and lover, but also a prophet, because she stands up against patriarchal versions of divinity, for example, and she puts forward in a very rich way what it means to bring the divine feminine, the motherhood of God, alive. And I think we need that so badly today. I think patriarchy has run away with a lot of religion and a lot of cultural suppositions. And our destruction of Mother Earth today, matricide is what I call it, killing of the mother, is directly related to a consciousness that no longer sees nature as sacred and Mother Earth as sacred. So I think she's so relevant to our time. I think, frankly, it took 700 years to prepare the way for her. It took a women's movement, a strong women's movement, and maybe even it took this destruction of Mother Earth to pave the way for Julian's wisdom. So she brings wisdom today that is uncannily appropriate for this critical time in Earth history and human history.
So beautiful. See why I want to teach with this guy? Who is such a feminist and so deeply rooted in the love of the mother. For me, Julian is fascinating for all kinds of reasons. One is she's the first woman to write in the English language. She was a contemporary of Chaucer, but of course she wasn't known because women were not given a voice. In fact, there's a lot of speculation that she very carefully concealed her writings because they were so subversive and dangerous. And I love that about her. I love that she was a holy troublemaker. She had a near-death experience, and that's when the visions broke through as she was lying on what she and everyone around her believed to be her deathbed, is when these visions, these 17 showings, she called them, came through. And her near-death experience is I think, very important to understanding Julian, that she was brought down to the bottom. And her illness may very well have been precipitated by anguish, by despair from living through, as Matthew said, round after round of the plague that decimated the population of Europe and probably took half the people Julian loved. And this was the context in which she almost left her life. And then the other thing that I love about Julian is that she spent the second half of her life, or I guess it would be 2/3, cloistered, kind of. She enclosed herself in this cell, right, that was attached to the Church of St. Julian. We don't even know her real name. That's why they call her Julian. And lived a life of contemplative prayer and writing. And that's the life that I kind of have. And it's the life that many of us are invited into right now because of the pandemic. And we're being driven back inside again. Another round where we're asked to shelter in place. And winter's coming, at least here in this hemisphere. And it's harder to mingle with people outside. So once again, we're being invited into a space of stillness and reevaluation and contemplation. And Julian is a beautiful model of how to do that without being a hermit, because she also had the window that opened out onto the street of Norwich where she could give counsel and receive goodies, and who knows what all happened through that window. But so she was alone but connected. And I think that's such a beautiful model for us right now. There, have we answered every single question you all have?
That's right. We'll just chat for the rest of our time together. I want to thank you both, Mirabai and Matthew, for starting us off with a pretty good foundation. So now we have the rest of our time together to dive into our viewers' questions as we prepare for Mirabai and Matthew's upcoming course. Again, it's called Julian of Norwich. It begins Wednesday, December 2nd. And if you want to check out the website and learn more about the 7-week course, you can visit julianofnorwichcourse.com to see the full description. And I want to let you know there is a silent W in there. It's Norwich. That's how we're spelling her name. So let's go ahead and get into some questions. If you have a question for Matthew or Mirabai, go ahead and type it in. I'll be happy to read them. And in the meantime, we've got a question that just came in. This is from Marie, who says, did I understand you to say that we don't know Julian's true identity? How was her work discovered and eventually published?
That's a good question. Matthew?
Well, it wasn't published for 300 years. I say that's kind of a long time to have to wait for your first book review. But as Mirabai alluded to, Chaucer was published as soon as a printing press was invented, about 100 years after his death. Julian, who was a contemporary, she was not published for 300 years. And even then, when she was finally published, she was not broadly read. Now, in the 19th century, Florence Nightingale read her, and she inspired Florence Nightingale to develop her vocation, that of nursing. And so that's significant. In the early 20th century, T.S. Eliot employed Julian in his 4 quartets. But I think there are 2 reasons why she wasn't published. One is, as as Mirabai alluded to, she was a woman, and she was the first woman writing in English. But also, she herself talks about a little bit of concern about how well her ideas will be received in the Christian community of the 14th century. Because there are times in her writings when she says things like, well, the church teaches that God is wrathful, but I don't see any wrath in God. I see wrath in human beings. In other words, projection is going on, she's proposing there. So, but she was quite aware. Now, it was women. In fact, it was, I think, the great niece of Thomas More, St. Thomas More, who took her works to Holland a couple centuries after she died. And they created a women's community there. And this women's communities kept her works alive. And not just that community, but others too. I think some Benedictines and so forth, also women Benedictines kept her works alive. And of course, remember, up until Chaucer came along and his books were printed 100 years after his death, that in Julian's day, every book had to be written out by hand. And she was not part of a community like a Benedictine community, for example. Hildegard of Bingen got her works disseminated because her sisters and others helped to write them. But Julian, being in not in a cloister as such, but in a anchorage, didn't have a team to write her works. But as Mirabai said, she kept rewriting her book, kind of bringing it up to date throughout her lifetime, because she had a great dream. She realized there were many layers to her visions and to her book. And so you see there, if you kind of follow the three versions we have, the short version that came first and then the other two, you can see a development very much like living with the dream for a long time and realizing there are many layers there.
That's beautiful. And the only thing I would add is, so we don't know her name. We don't know really anything about her biography. There's a fairly good, very good, I think, BBC documentary that was done recently that tries to piece together the historical facts of her life. But she kept herself anonymous intentionally. The only thing we know in the beginning is that she had a mom and that her mother was there at her bedside, and she loved her. But we don't really know much else about her. So she's only called Julian because of the Church of St. Julian there in Norwich that her anchorage was built onto. So that's just sort of shorthand for this anonymous woman. And, there are stories that she hid the writings under her bed, and that she had every intention of these younger women who would come to her for counsel, who may have been sort of her personal assistants and attendants in some ways, that they would keep her writings safe after she died. The only other thing I want to say is that I'm reading a beautiful novel right now. It's not yet published. I'm reading the advanced reader's copy to endorse, by a woman who writes historical fiction, up really trying to bring women like Julian to the fore, and the author is Mary Sherratt, and the book is called Revelations. She also did a book called Illuminations, a novel about Hildegard that was very good. And I'm learning so much because Mary Sherratt's book is research-based about the life of Julian of Norwich, but it's also about Marjorie Kemp, who was a follower of Julian's and a mystic in her own right. So I love historical fiction for learning about beings like this, and I don't know if there's a place I can let you know about that. But anyway, it's called Revelations by Mary Sherratt.
One thing that comes out from these two scholars who did the critical edition of her book, one is an Augustinian, one is a Jesuit, they say, first of all, she was very well educated. So they propose that maybe she went to France for her education and got it at a Benedictine monastery, women's monastery. Or maybe she attended a women's monastery, Benedictine again, in England. But I do think you see a lot of the Benedictine tradition in her teaching. And so much of it is built around wisdom. And wisdom is a very primal category in the creation spiritual tradition, and therefore with Benedict and Scholastica, his sister, who founded that order about 900 years before Julian. So I think that's something that I learned from them recently, that she was, and also Norwich at the time was the second largest city in England. Only London was larger, and it was a very wealthy city, and they had very good libraries. So she clearly was very educated. But one thing that's interesting is she doesn't footnote anything, even the scriptures. She doesn't quote them much. It's very interesting that she's primarily working from her own experience, but she's obviously absorbed a lot of teaching and a lot of scripture and the rest, especially wisdom scripture. Like that one sentence from the Book of Wisdom, I think just says everything about Julian. Wisdom is the mother of all good things. That's in Book of Wisdom 7:10-11. Wisdom is the mother of all good things. I think that's her emphasis on goodness, and that's her emphasis on wisdom and on the motherhood of God. So I think that one sentence, more than any other single source, summarizes Julian's consciousness and theology. And now I also think that she was influenced by Meister Eckhart and Aquinas in a deep way. I think the Dominicans, who were very alive in Norwich at the time, I think they got to Julian. Perhaps she had one as a spiritual director or something. But there's so much of Aquinas and so much of Eckhart in her writings. But again, it's part of this lineage of the creation spiritual tradition.
Wow, I can't wait for this class to learn more. This is already so fascinating. Let's go ahead and dive into more questions here. This is one from Deborah, who says, being able to shelter in place was a privilege for both for Julian and for some of us. How can we live with the fact that some of us can do this and others cannot? Perhaps this is a deeper question about feeling both gratitude and guilt when one has privilege.
Oh, such a good question. Matthew, are you moved to dive in there?
I think you should go first.
Okay. Yeah, I've been really grappling with that myself. And that question really resonates with me. I think I spent the first few months of this pandemic feeling guilty about how happy I felt because I had been traveling a ton. I don't know, for the last 10 years, probably being on the road, maybe 75% of the time toward the end, the last couple of years. And I was exhausted. I loved it. I loved all the places I would go and giving workshops and retreats and things. But I was soul weary, and I live in this beautiful place in northern New Mexico at the edge of national forest in the mountains, and just was longing for home and for this land. And so here I was, and I started to write again, just for the joy of it, and I was realizing at the same time, at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, that while I was resting and renewing my soul, there are people on the front lines who are dealing every day with horrific suffering, and people just having to go to work every day, regardless, and to protect themselves and protect their families. There were people who were dying alone. There were people who couldn't see their loved ones as they were dying. This is still the case. So what I've begun to try to do is shift out of guilt and shame about my privilege to be able to shelter in place, as Julian was able to, and instead trust in the goodness, as Matthew pointed out with Julian, that this is as it should be, and that I need to build a robust container right now to be able to hold what is needed and bring that back into the world. And so for those of you who, like me, grapple with that sense of privilege and guilt, maybe we could reframe that as it is our invitation. I don't want to say obligation or duty or anything like that. That's the patriarchy, but it is our invitation by the Holy One now to cultivate a space of equanimity and joy, so that we can be a source of equanimity and joy in the world that is going to need to be rebuilt by all of us together, a world built in love going forward. I hope that doesn't sound like a spiritual bypass.
No, I think it's very very profound and to the mark. One of my favorite teachings in Julian is this. She says, charged with the quality of reverence and loving awe, we turn ourselves with all our might toward the actions to which we are guided. And I think that's just how Mirabai just ended her response to this question. That, of course, people find themselves in different places. And like she alluded to, many are on the front lines and truly risking their lives to save others. Some as nurses and doctors and healthcare workers, but also people who are doing what we're calling essential work, grocery store and drug stores, and all those important vocations that we're beginning to recognize today and learning not to take for granted. But yes, it is a privilege to be able to be indoors and still survive financially and so forth. But again, I think what Mirabai is talking about and what Julian talks about is really important. Charged with the quality of reverence and loving awe, we turn ourselves with all our might toward the actions that are asked of us. And so, like Mirabai ended saying, I think we have to reinvent our relationship to nature. Coronavirus didn't drop out of the sky. It's related to climate change. It's related to the way we've been beating up on Mother Earth for centuries. So, and then some people say, oh, we want to go back to normal. No, I think we want to go forward to a new normal that doesn't put humans above the rest of Mother Earth, above the rest of creation. Because this is why we're being bitten, literally, by other species on whose territory we are encroaching. So I think that this pandemic is a wake-up call, still another one, because it wasn't enough, I guess, last summer, a year ago, that an entire continent was on fire, Australia, or this year that the West Coast, and where I live here in California, was on fire like never before, or these incredible hurricanes and floods are happening in the south and southeast of our country. And this is just the beginning of our feeling the realities of climate change. And to think that half of America is in denial about climate change. I mean, Meister Eckhart says, God is a denial of denial. So in other words, where denial reigns, God is gone because truth is gone. And Julian's, one of Julian's really important and strong teachings is not to be in denial about suffering, not to be in denial about suffering. That's how her book begins. And she keeps returning to that theme, that nothing gets accomplished if we wallow in denial or in guilt. So I do think it's about a vocation, our being called to reinvent our species, reinvent the way we do education, and politics, and economics, and medicine, and law, and religion, because something's missing. And that's where she's so right on, I think. What's missing is the feminine dimension. If we really incorporated a balance, which she calls, as she says, God is delighted to be our father and God is delighted to be our mother. Okay, there's a balance, a gender balance. We don't have a balance. It's nowhere found in academia, in education. Rarely is it found. It's all patriarchal. It's all about knowledge and not wisdom. And then you go on from there, because we train so many of our professions, of course, in academia. So law, politics, economics, even business and religion gets poisoned by this imbalance between the feminine and the masculine in our culture. And this is what is killing Mother Earth. This is the matricide that's going on. So this is serious stuff. It's not like a little petting that we're doing to the feminine, say, oh, isn't it nice to talk about God as mother? No, there's something very radical in Julian about deconstructing the presumption that we're healthy human beings when we run only on energy of the reptilian brain and of I win and you lose and so forth. And that's what's destroying the earth and is now beginning to destroy our species. So I think what Mirabai says and what Julian says is so important. We have to reinvent our species and live differently on this planet, on this earth, on this mother earth. And to do so, we have to take on, men and women alike, the qualities of motherhood more than just the qualities of the reptilian brain.
Yes.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you both so much. Anybody who's just joining us, we're here with Matthew Fox and Mirabai Starr learning about their upcoming course, Julian of Norwich, which begins Wednesday, December 2nd, and you can log on to julianofnorwichcourse.com for all the details and to register. Let me get back into the questions here. I'd like to read two, if you don't mind, because they're very similar, but completely different. Janet is asking, she was not a nun. What kind of community did she live in? And Angeline is saying, I'm not familiar with the concept of an anchorage. Can you say more about this practice? And do you have any sense of why Julian chose this arrangement versus something else?
Great questions. Yeah, Matthew's very, very grounded in the historical context. So, Matthew, would you mind addressing what? So the first one was.
It is significant. It is very significant that she did not choose to be a nun or a Benedictine, especially if she went through a Benedictine training as a school, as I do believe she did, and other scholars have suggested that too. I think that because if she had been a Benedictine, she would have had a whole community around her, and her life would have been very different from living as an anchorist. Also, of course, most of the monasteries were out in the countryside more than in the cities at the time. But she was a city person. Her, as I said, Norwich was a very important city, second largest city in England at the time. And she was there. And I think that and as Mirabai stressed, she had this window whereby she served people as a counselor, a spiritual director, if you will. They would come and visit her there. Also, her church was just a few blocks up a hill from a river. And my thinking is that she counseled a lot of sailors, perhaps some drunk and some not so drunk, in the middle of the night, maybe, as they came up and passed her place. And she's so grounded. She's so earthy. She's so ordinary in her language and in her images that, she's not caught up in theological, what should I say, airy-fairy ideas. She's very concrete and down to earth. And I think that reveals a lot of her personality. Now, in England, in the previous century, there were about 200 anchoresses in the country. So it was a formal ritual approved by the church that made you an anchoress or an anchorite. So the men were called anchorites. The bishop would have a ceremony, a ritual, where they literally bricked you in, and he would bless you and all that for that, and then you were committed there for the rest of your life. That was the lifestyle of their anchoress. So it wasn't like a hermit who lives alone, but the hermit usually goes out to the countryside to live alone. But she was attached to the church, and there was a hole in her cell that led directly into the sanctuary of the church, so she could attend mass and so forth. And then there was a window on the other side of her cell, so that she was open to the country, to the city people. So it was a unique vocation, but it was officially approved by the culture and by the church. And very often these anchoresses and anchorites were held in very high esteem by the city people. They felt these were very special people who were praying and undergoing contemplation for the sake of the greater community. So it was not cut off. But once again, there was a tremendous challenge in it, not only to keep your your mental stability, but also that you did not have a whole community supporting you and working with you. There was something quite solitary about it, for sure. And I think it's obviously had a lot to do with Julian's insights and the depth of her plummeting into her visions and into her life experience. Now, Mirabai may want to add to that, but I just want to, that's my answer to the question.
Yeah, no, I think that's beautiful. I mean, I guess I'll add to it by showing you that the cover of my translation of Julian's showings, this is a 19th century painting, I think a Flemish artist, and it shows that window looking out onto the busy city street of Norwich, and Julian sitting inside, contemplating, reading probably her book. The things on the windowsill that look like loaves of bread, I'm told, were actually beehives. She kept bees inside. And some say that there was also a little door that went out to a small courtyard where she may have grown some vegetables and herbs, and may have also had a cat as a companion. And as Matthew said, that beside the window that opened to the street, which could be closed when it was her time to just be contemplative and not be connected. But there was also the window through which she could observe the religious mass in the church and receive communion. So it was this beautiful balance. It's this blend of connected and solitary that I think really, again, speaks to our times. And as Matthew said, Julian was very grounded and practical and down to earth and warm and relational. You know, you just feel it. Her writing exudes this kind of warm relationality. So there was nothing aloof and holier than thou about Julian of Norwich, which I think is also a beautiful guide for us going forward, where this sort of masculine paradigm that we have all inherited from all the religions of the world that sets apart certain people, usually men, as being the ordained spokespeople for religious truth. You know, someone like Julian dispenses with that and says again and again in her writings that she understood that she was given these visions, these showings, these revelations of divine love, not for her because she was so great, but for all beings. This was given to her to share with others, and that it's the whole community of souls that need to be told again and again that you have done nothing wrong, that you are unconditionally loved by an unconditionally loving Mother God.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Thank you so much for all of that. I don't even want to go into questions. I just want to sit here and think for a minute. But let's go back into the questions. So this is a question from Samuel, who says, Julian's understanding of the divine comes from her cloistering. What relevance does her perspective offer those of us regarding intimacy with our partner, family, and friends?
Who do you want to go first?
Whoever would like to jump in.
Well, I'll just jump in and say, her whole theology is based on the goodness of nature. And that includes human nature. It includes all our relations. It certainly includes our relationship to the rest of nature besides the human. As Mirabai alluded to, it's very likely that she had a cat. And on the cover of the book, and the original painting for the cover of the book is right behind me here, the artist has her book, God is Mother, with paw prints on it. If you can see that, the paw prints on the book. So that was his way of bringing the cat into the picture. And of course, Mirabai just talked about a garden, and Julian talks about a garden. So the point is that Julian had relationships, obviously with human beings, and Mirabai alluded to the fact that we do have the names, strange to tell, of her two helpers, women helpers. One was named Anna, and one was named, I forget, Sarah. And so there were relationships there, in addition to the relationships she had through the window in counseling people. And of course, relationships to her family. Now, Mirabai makes a very important guess, I think, intellectual guess, that it's very likely that Julian lost family members, maybe her child and maybe her husband in the pandemic, because between 35 and 50% of the population died due to the pandemic in Julian's day. And of course, they didn't have any news about a vaccine or any hope of a vaccine in her time. Science was not on board with this, didn't understand it at all. So you can imagine the amount of confusion and dread that was going on, anxiety and angst in Julian's day. And that's one thing that, again, makes her stand out so much. She was so grounded and in the goodness of nature. She didn't say that God was out to get people, which is what a lot of people were saying. Also, there was a lot of scapegoating going on in her day. For example, there was scapegoating of the Jews. In fact, it was so strong that many Jews fled England at that time and went to the continent to get away from the anti-Semitism. There's not a word of anti-Semitism in all of Julian's work. So, so the point I'm trying to make is that the depths of our relationships are played out not just by how we treat our family, but how we treat all of creation. And that's how Julian frames the struggle that was going on in her time. And that is the context for any creation spirituality philosophy, that you begin with the whole, you begin with creation itself. And instead of denouncing it, for example, she has a great line where she says, she says, do not, let me get this right now. She says, do not put creation down. She says, God does not despise creation. God does not despise creation. Some people around her were saying, oh, God's given up on the human race. So there's vengeance going on here. We're all going to die, or at least half are going to die, and et cetera, et cetera. Julian had dealt not with any of that. But again, her point about love is that love permeates everything, because goodness permeates everything. And what is love except a response to goodness? So that's the basis, I call it the metaphysics, really, of her worldview, the goodness in everything. And she keeps calling us back to that. And yes, that includes your family. But it's not restricted to your family, because like most mystics before the 21st century, she was into the interdependence of all things. Our urban living and the Enlightenment that became so anthropocentric, human-centered, what Pope Francis calls narcissistic about our species, this was not part of the consciousness of pre-modern people. It's not part of the Native American consciousness, and it was not part of these medieval mystics like Hildegard and Aquinas and Eckhart and Francis and Julian. Not at all. They lived in a world, like Native people do, of the whole cosmos comes first before the humans. And I think that's another area where Julian has so much to teach us today, to get over our anthropocentrism, which is doing havoc to the earth, havoc to our health, because coronavirus comes out of the denial of climate change, and havoc to our souls.
And, you know, your question is relevant to all of us and connects with all the mystics that we can draw upon, is how do we look to the lives of these great wisdom keepers, the mystics across the centuries and across the spiritual traditions, when their lives were perhaps very different from ours? Like, I forgot to add, the people, when I speak about being privileged to be at home and to be hiking and writing and making a living online and so on. And I talked about the people on the front lines, but what about all of the people who are educating their children at home, and how incredibly stressful that is? And so how do we do this kind of love work in the trenches of family life and intimate relationships that are beautiful and wonderful and life-giving and can be a real refuge, but can also be a source of tremendous challenge? I mean, my teacher Ramdas said, you think you have your shit together? Go spend a week with your family. Family can bring it all up. And one of the things I love so much about Julian is she says so many times in so many places in the showings, don't wallow in guilt. It is pointless. God doesn't blame you for anything. So stop going over and over how you got it wrong and you did harm. You make amends, you pick yourself up, you do what you can to mend what you have broken. And then don't keep going back over all the ways that you missed the mark with your loved ones, with whatever it may be that we like to beat ourselves up about. And family and intimate relationships are an incredible crucible for bringing that love into awareness and embodying it. So, good question.
Great answer. Thank you both. In fact, I want to mention, for those of you who are confused why they're showing different book covers, they've each written a book on Julian of Norwich. Matthew's is called Julian of Norwich, Wisdom in a Time of Pandemic and Beyond. And Mirabai's is Showings of Julian of Norwich, a new translation. So go ahead and pick those up if you're interested. We have time for a few more questions, but before we take those, I'll go ahead and give a few details about the class itself, because people are asking about that. Now, this is going to be such a powerful 7-week journey with Matthew and Mirabai and their obviously expert guidance, where you'll participate in readings, chants, and meditations using Julian's own words to reframe these tumultuous times and step into her positivity and look ahead to a more hopeful future. This 7-week course takes place on Wednesdays at 5 p.m. Pacific, beginning Wednesday, December 2nd. And if you can't join us live, as I mentioned earlier, that's fine. You won't miss the teachings. You will receive audio and video recordings, transcripts, and all course handouts on your course homepage. And you get to keep these forever. That's not just limited to the 7 weeks that the class is going. Also, I'd like to remind everyone that we offer a no-risk money-back guarantee on all of our courses, giving you a full 2 weeks until December 16th, in this case, to make sure that you absolutely love it. And as an added option, all participants are welcome to connect in a private Facebook community group so you can connect with one another. Also, everyone who registers receives the Julian of Norwich bonus collection. First, you'll receive a video teaching from Mirabai entitled The Face of the Holy One, the Unconditional Love of God the Mother. And next, you'll receive a video dialogue with Matthew and Andrew Harvey called Julian of Norwich and the Powerful Wisdom She Brings to Our Challenging Times. Then you'll receive an audio collection from Mirabai entitled Prayer Poems to the Divine Feminine. Plus, you'll get a video dialogue with Matthew and Michael Stone called Mystical Wisdom for Hard Times, Aquinas and Julian of Norwich on Spirituality of Crisis, Pandemics, and Social Injustice. And when you register by midnight Pacific, Thursday, November 19th, you'll receive this extra gift. That is a video panel discussion with Mirabai, Matthew, and James Twyman called Sheltering in Place, Dispatches from a Contemporary Anchorite. So before we get back into questions, Mirabai, Matthew, what are you most looking forward to sharing in your upcoming course?
Ladies first.
I just would love to be able to offer a little dose of hope and what Julian calls trust in what's happening right now, because I think so many of us are starting to become really soul weary in face of this ongoing pandemic, social injustice, craziness in the political arena that it shows no signs of letting up. It's starting to really wear us down. People are dying. We now, like at first, many of us didn't know anyone who had COVID. Now I hardly know anyone who doesn't know someone who has suffered from this disease. So this, I feel, will be a sanctuary, a refuge, but also very specific ways that we can reframe the sorrow and weariness of our times in terms of Julian's sweet and powerful claiming of the goodness of all that is. I hope it'll fill us up, refill us.
Well, I'm so glad you went for it first, Mirabai, because that was beautiful. And I want to say ditto to it. David Orr, the eco-philosopher, defines hope. You brought up the word hope. Hope is a verb with the sleeves rolled up, he says. Hope is a verb with the sleeves rolled up. So I think in plummeting and meditating with Julian of Norwich, that all of her deconstructing of dualism and of patriarchy and of guilt, as you say, and of anger, wrath, and reconstructing. She doesn't just take things apart, but she reconstructs things in terms of the goodness of nature and the goodness of our nature, and how we're born in joy, as she says. We have a birthright for unending joy, she says. That these qualities, to bring these back to our beings and therefore to our institutions, to our ways of doing education and politics and medicine and economics and business and religion, this really is a revolution, nonviolent revolution that Julian is proposing. And we need something truly remarkably radical today to move us beyond this situation of anthropocentrism and of denial of Mother Earth and her suffering. And I think that Julian brings it in a very, as you say, in a gentle way. She's not pounding us over the head. But I think that what our species is looking for today, Julian brings in a beautiful way. And we don't want to go back to the old normal, because the old normal is what brought us here in the first place. We want a new normal. And I think if you look at Julian's teachings in the context of all the spiritual teachings of the world, you'll find that, for example, compassion is such an important word to the Dalai Lama and to Buddhism, but it is to Islam, and it is to Judaism, and it is to the teachings of Jesus. And, how many of us have ever had a class in school on compassion or on all our relations, relating to all of nature, the way we want to relate to one another? So there's a cosmology, there's a worldview. One of Julian's teachings is captured on the cover of my book here, or this painting right behind me, was that she experienced a nut, a hazelnut, and it was like glowing. And she said, "What is this?" And she got the answer: this is the whole universe you're holding in your hand, and it is surrounded by love. So the artist who created the cover for my book here is depicting that special moment, that Julian has a cosmic sense. She's not just talking about the human, which far too many theologians have talked about for centuries, but of the whole cosmos, all of creation. And it glows with the radiance of the cosmic Christ, of the Buddha, of the Shekinah, of the image of God, that it is all sacred. And this is the ultimate revolution, to recover the sense that our existence is sacred. And I think science really helps today because we've got a new creation story, 13.8 billion years that brought us here. And by us, I mean all the beings we share the earth with and all the galaxies we share the universe with and all of us, our species. We're so late to the table. How can we persist in being ego-centered or species-centered at this time? For one thing, that path is suicidal. We are on a suicidal path, an extinction path. The human race is headed for extinction. And the scientists of the United Nations 2 years ago said we had 10 years left. So we've got 8 years now to change our consciousness. And with it, our actions. And I think we need people like Julian who can lead us in this transformation, undoing patriarchal dualism and violence, and reptilian brain energy, and replacing it with mammal brain energy, which is about kinship and family and compassion. And she goes on a lot about how the essence of motherhood is compassion. And of course, the word compassion comes from the word in Hebrew and in Greek for the womb. So the mammals, the womb animals, and that includes us, are supposed to bring compassion to the world. Not more militarism, not more violence, but more compassion. And there lies our salvation, if you will. So Julian brings so much that we need today.
Arabic too. That Rahman and Rahim are the root for both of those are womb. And the Salat every day, Bismillah Rahman Rahim, we begin in the name of God who is mercy and compassion. And that word, the root of that word, both of them, mercy and compassion, is womb.
In Arabic as well as in Hebrew.
All right. Wow. Well, thank you both for that. We've got time for one quick question. There are actually many people who are asking about how interactive will the class actually be. I mentioned that there will be chanting and meditation, et cetera, but people will be able to interact with the both of you, et cetera. So maybe we can address that.
Yeah, I'll jump in there, if I may. So one of the great gifts of this course is that my dear friend, renowned singer-songwriter Jenny Bird has created, I just threw some quotes at her, my favorite quotes from Julian. She created a series of exquisite chants for each one of these kind of Julian quotes. And so at the beginning of each class session, we're going to do a short contemplative practice that we'll do the chant that Jenny created. And then together, with your mics muted, because otherwise it's cacophony on Zoom, but you'll do it in your own home. It'll be call and response. And then we'll go into a short period of contemplative presence, just a few minutes of silence. And then we'll be giving teachings. And I'm going to tell you in a second how that's going to alternate with Matthew and me. But after the teachings, we'll have a substantial period for questions and responses. The last half hour or so of every class session. And then you have small groups, breakout groups with a seed question from the class for half an hour. And as Lisa said, there's also the Facebook community page where a lot of shared wisdom unfolds. And then Matthew and I are going to be both alternating and also co-teaching. So we're teaching together the first and last session, and also the middle session, which is on the motherhood of God. And then the 4 remaining sessions we're alternating. He'll have one, I'll have one, he'll have one, I'll have one, but we're going to be present for each other's classes. So that's in a nutshell, kind of how that'll go. Interaction, contemplation, teachings.
All right, perfect. Wow. Well, thank you both so much. This has been a wonderful hour. I cannot wait for this class. I will be there as well, so I'm really looking forward to this. I want to thank our viewers for being with us today and for all of your questions. Once again, Julian of Norwich begins Wednesday, December 2nd. And again, you can visit julianofnorwichcourse.com to learn more or to register. So before we go, Matthew, Mirabai, in whichever order you choose, do you have any final words for our viewers?
Go ahead,
Well,
Matthew.
I look forward to meeting you all and being with you and Julian. It's been my privilege to have a vocation for over 50 years where I have been in a position where I've been able to teach a lot and to get to know a lot of the mystics, especially of the West. And mystics can change lives in so many ways. They heal. They reach us at such a deep level. I remember one student I had years ago who was herself a therapist. She'd been abused by her father as a child, and she went through a lot of therapy to heal. But when we dealt with Meister Eckhart in class on Meister Eckhart, she said this is a whole new level of healing that she didn't get in therapy. So I think that there's a lot of woundedness in our world today, of course, for a lot of reasons, but that the mystics bring something that is really needed in our efforts at healing ourselves and healing one another. And I think Julian especially, I think there's a reason she's been so silenced for 700 years. I don't think we were ready for her. I think we are now. I think that the women's movement has kind of set the table for the quiet revolution that Julian is proposing. And I also think that the darkness of our times, the despair of our times, vis-a-vis climate change and the suffering of Mother Earth and coronavirus and the other pandemics that are coming down the road, I think all this also urges us to take notice, to stand up, to be courageous, and to feed our souls, nurture them with teachers of wisdom. And Julian is clearly one of those teachers, and she's so fresh because she's been so ignored for centuries. And she speaks in this marvelous English that she helped to invent. She helped to invent our language. And it's very fresh, her language, and words like wanting, for example. And she invented the word enjoy. So, I mean, how could this not be both fun and deep an experience together? So I look forward to that. And I certainly look forward to teaching with Mirabai, who has so much to teach me and the rest of us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Matthew. Well, and that's exactly what I was about to say is it is such an honor to be invited to teach with Matthew Fox, who has been such a mentor to me, even when he didn't even know I existed for decades. And so it's just a joy to be able to teach together. We've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes, and we flow together so effortlessly, and that I'm just very much looking forward to this collaboration, to be able to I love the picture on the cover of that the Shift Network put together of this horse. It looks like I'm standing on his shoulders, and that's indeed how I feel, like I'm standing on the shoulders of a giant. So it's such a privilege to be able to do this together, and I think it will be a joy as well for all of us. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you both again, Mirabai and Matthew. It has been such a pleasure speaking with you today. I always enjoy spending time with you. Thank you again.
Thank you, Lisa, for your leadership.
All right. And once again, I want to thank everyone who joined us today. On behalf of all of us at the Shift Network, I wish you well and look forward to having you on this course or perhaps another one in the future. Have a great day, everyone.